Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then settled into the historical record as the most notorious unsolved poisoning in England. A single household, 3 deaths, and a question that dozens of days of inquest could not answer. The case of Vera Sidney begins in South Croydon in the winter of 1929. Croydon at that time was a substantial town on the southern edge of London in the county of Surrey, prosperous and expanding, joined to the capital by rail and by the new arterial roads that carried motor traffic out of the city each evening. It was a town of some 190,000 residents, grown quickly in the preceding decades from a market town into a comfortable suburban centre, with its own tramways, its own gasworks, its own well-appointed shopping streets, and a settled professional and independent class who kept servants and dined in one another's houses. The war had ended a decade before, and the town had passed into the guarded prosperity of the years between the wars, when appearances were maintained with particular care and the respectable districts guarded their quiet. Birdhurst Rise lay in one of those districts, a road of large late Victorian and Edwardian villas set back behind gardens, in the quarter of South Croydon favoured by families of independent means. The houses were substantial, of red brick and tile, with drawing rooms and morning rooms, and quarters for a cook and a maid. The households along these streets kept to a settled rhythm of luncheons and suppers, of visits between relatives who lived within a few minutes' walk of one another, of tonics taken at the table, and medicines kept upon the sideboard. It was a world in which a bottle of prescribed medicine, a jug of soup carried between kitchens, and a shared family meal were entirely ordinary, and in which nothing about them was thought to require watching. Into this settled quarter, the Sidney family had gathered themselves closely. They were a middle-class family of independent means, several of them living within a few streets of the others, and it was their habit to dine constantly in one another's houses, so that the members of the family passed in and out of each other's homes almost daily. That habit of constant intimate dining is the fact upon which the whole case would afterwards turn, for it is what gave any hand the repeated and unremarkable access to food and drink that the deaths required. At the time it was simply the ordinary courtesy of a close family, and no one remarked upon it. At the centre of the household at 29 Birdhurst Rise was Violet Amelia Sidney, the widowed matriarch, 69 years of age. She was a widow of some years, her late husband having died and left her annuities and small legacies and expectations, rather than any great fortune. She lived in the large and comfortable villa at Birdhurst Rise, and she kept a cook and the settled establishment of a woman of her class and generation. She was known as a careful and particular woman, regular in her habits, and among those habits was the taking of a bottled tonic medicine, a prescribed preparation kept in the house, and taken at intervals, as such tonics commonly were in those years. Living with her at Birdhurst Rise was her unmarried daughter, Vera Sidney, 40 years of age. Vera was a woman of independent means with a modest income of her own, and she was not, as the sick-room cases of an earlier age might suggest, an invalid or a recluse. She was active and sociable, fond of golf and of motoring, a woman who moved freely in the comfortable leisure of her class and district. She lived quietly with her mother in the villa, sharing the household and its table, and her days followed the unhurried pattern of a woman of settled means in a prosperous suburb between the wars. The family extended beyond that house. Violet Sidney's son, Thomas Sidney, known as Tom, lived nearby. He was a professional entertainer, a pianist and performer who had made his living upon the variety and music hall stage, a man of charm and of public performance who had married an American wife named Margaret. His household stood within easy reach of his mother's, and he and his family were part of the constant passage between the homes. Violet's married daughter Grace lived close by as well. Grace had married Edmund Crichton Duff, and she was described by those who knew the family as warm, energetic, and dominant in personality. a woman of force and activity who was much about the family's houses. Edmund Crichton Duff, Grace's husband, was a retired colonial official who had served in the colonial service in Nigeria. He was considerably older than his wife, a man who had spent his working life in the administration of the colonies and had returned to England to a quiet retirement in Croydon among his wife's people. He and Grace had children who were alive in the household throughout the events that followed, and who were unharmed by them. The children remained well and untouched while the adults about them sickened and died, and it is only necessary to record that they came to no harm. Such was the family, the widowed mother and her unmarried daughter in the villa at Birdhurst Rise, the entertainer's son and his American wife nearby, the married daughter and her retired colonial husband within a few streets, and the children of that marriage. They were a family of no great wealth, but of comfortable settled means, bound together by daily habit and by the small legacies and expectations that would, before the year was out, become matters examined in open court. Their financial position was comfortable but not lavish, resting upon annuities, small legacies, and the expectations that attended them, and it was precisely because money in the family took the form of such expectations that questions of inheritance became live and pressing once the deaths began. If you value cases told this way, drawn from records rather than speculation, subscribe to the channel. Now back to the record. The first of the 3 deaths came not in the villa at Birdhurst Rise but in the household of Edmund and Grace Duff in the spring of the preceding year. Edmund Duff had been away from home on a fishing holiday in Hampshire, a commonplace absence for a retired man of his habits. He returned to Croydon on the 26th of April 1928, and upon his return he ate supper at home in the ordinary way. Within a day he was taken violently ill, seized with a sudden and severe gastric illness that came upon him with little warning. He declined rapidly, and on the 27th of April 1928 he died at his home in Croydon, 59 years of age. The illness had been sudden and its course had been short, and to the doctors who attended him and to the family who mourned him, it presented as one of those acute internal illnesses that carried off men of middle age without apparent cause for suspicion. His death was attributed at the time to natural causes. A man had returned from a holiday, taken ill, and died within a day or two, and there was, in that sequence, as it then appeared, nothing to summon the attention of the authorities. He was buried, and the household closed over the loss, and for the better part of a year the matter rested there, an ordinary bereavement in an ordinary family. Nothing in the manner of his death, as it was then understood, connected it to anything beyond itself. Nearly 10 months passed. In the middle of February 1929 the illness returned to the family, this time within the villa at Birdhurst Rise, and this time it fell upon Vera Sidney. The circumstances of her final illness were afterwards examined with great care, for they turned upon an ordinary dish of soup. Vera ate soup at home, a soup prepared in the household kitchen, and she was taken ill after eating it. She was not, however, the only creature in the house to sicken. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Noakes, had eaten some of the same soup, and she too was taken ill. The household cat, which had been given some of the soup, sickened as well, and the cat died. That the cook and the cat should have sickened from the same dish as Vera was a detail of the gravest importance, though its meaning was not grasped at the time. Vera appeared at first to rally from the illness. She recovered enough that the alarm receded, and on the following day she ate again of the same soup. After that second helping her condition declined once more, and this time it did not turn. She collapsed and grew steadily worse, and on the 16th of February 1929, she died at Birdhurst Rise, 40 years of age. Some accounts of the case place her death on the 14th rather than the 16th, and the record differs on the point, so that the exact day cannot be stated with complete certainty. It fell in the middle of February 1929. Her death, like Edmund Duff's before it, was at first assigned to natural causes. The attending medical opinion attributed it to gastric influenza, an illness much spoken of in those years, and one whose symptoms of gastric collapse and prostration could resemble what had been seen at Vera's bedside. A woman of 40 had eaten, sickened, seemed to mend, sickened again, and died, and the diagnosis of gastric influenza covered the sequence without appearing to strain against it. The sickness of the cook was set down to the same influenza, and the death of the cat passed without formal account. Vera was buried, and a second bereavement settled over the family within a year of the first, and still there was nothing, as matters then stood, to draw the notice of any coroner. The record to this point held 2 deaths, 10 months apart in 2 houses of the same family, each attributed to a natural cause, each closed and buried without inquiry. A retired colonial official had died within a day of returning from a fishing holiday, and an unmarried woman of independent means had died after eating soup that had also sickened a servant and killed a cat. Taken separately, as they were then taken, neither death commanded suspicion. It was the third death, 3 weeks after the second, and in the same house, that would at last break the pattern open and carry the whole matter to the coroner. Violet Sidney died on the 5th of March 1929 in the villa at Birdhurst Rise, 3 weeks after her daughter, and in the same house. Her death, unlike the 2 that had gone before it, came in circumstances that could not be quietly assigned to an ordinary illness, and it was her death that carried the whole matter at last to the authorities. On that day she took a dose of her usual bottled tonic medicine at luncheon, the prescribed preparation she had been accustomed to take for some time. She had scarcely swallowed it before she complained that it tasted foul, that it was gritty and wrong, and she said so at once and plainly to those about her. Her condition deteriorated with a rapidity that left no room for the slow diagnoses that had covered the earlier deaths. Within hours of taking the tonic she was gravely ill, and within hours she was dead. A woman of 69 had taken her accustomed medicine at her own table, declared immediately that it was foul and gritty in her mouth, and died the same day. The suddenness of it, the plain complaint of the taste, and the fact that this was now the third death in one family within a 12-month were together enough to do what the 2 earlier deaths had not done, and to summon suspicion where before there had been none. The death of Violet Sidney was the death that broke the pattern open. 2 deaths, separated and buried, had raised no alarm. The third, hard upon the second, and in the same house, could not be passed over. Where Edmund Duff's death had been set down to natural causes, and Vera's to gastric influenza, Violet's death would not lie down under any such attribution, and suspicion at last reached the coroner. The machinery of the law, which had not stirred for the first 2 deaths, now began to move, and once it had begun to move, it turned back upon the 2 graves that had already closed. The investigation was formally opened, and its first and central instrument was exhumation. Because there had been no scene to preserve, no single room in which a body lay, awaiting the arrival of officers, the deaths having occurred in a private home across a span of months with the bodies already buried, the investigation could not proceed in the ordinary way of a murder discovered fresh. It proceeded instead through the disinterment and examination of the dead. The authorities ordered that the bodies be raised from the ground and given over to analysis, and this was done in turn. Violet Sidney's remains were examined first, for hers was the death that had raised the alarm, and hers the body most recently buried. The examination of her remains was followed by the exhumation and examination of Vera Sidney, dead some 3 weeks before her mother, and then by the exhumation and examination of Edmund Crichton Duff, dead the previous spring and buried the longest of the 3. One after another the graves were opened and the remains delivered to the analysts, so that 3 deaths which had been closed and separate were now gathered together upon the examination table as a single connected inquiry. The results of the analyses were consistent and they were grave. Arsenic was found in all 3 bodies: the retired colonial official who had died within a day of his fishing holiday, the unmarried daughter who had died after her soup, and the widowed mother who had died after her tonic, were each found upon examination to contain arsenic, What had been recorded as natural causes and as gastric influenza was overturned by the toxicology, and 3 deaths that had been separately explained away were revealed to share a single cause. The finding transformed the matter entirely. For arsenic in one body might conceivably be accounted for, but arsenic in all 3, in one family, across a single year, admitted of no innocent common explanation. With arsenic established in all 3 bodies, the Metropolitan Police took over the conduct of the case. Scotland Yard was brought in, and experienced officers were assigned to an investigation that presented, from its very beginning, difficulties of an unusual and forbidding kind. There was no scene to preserve, and no fresh evidence to gather in the ordinary sense. The deaths had occurred months apart in private houses, the food and drink long since consumed or discarded, the domestic vessels washed and returned to use, the bodies buried and only now raised. The investigation could not reconstruct a single moment of crime. It could only work backward, through the exhumations, through the chemical analysis of the remains, and through the exhaustive questioning of everyone who had been near the 3 when they fell ill. That questioning was the substance of the investigation. Officers took statements from the surviving members of the family, from the servants of the several households, and from the doctors who had attended the 3 deaths. Every meal, every visit, every bottle and jug and cup that could be remembered was gone over. The habit of constant intimate dining, which had once seemed the ordinary courtesy of a close family, now became the very field of the inquiry, for it meant that a great many hands had lawful and unremarkable access to what the 3 had eaten and drunk. The soup that Vera had eaten, which had also sickened the cook Mrs. Noakes and killed the household cat, was examined as closely as memory would allow. The tonic medicine that Violet had declared foul and gritty was subjected to particular scrutiny, for it was the one vessel whose contents had been complained of aloud at the moment of taking. The officers found themselves confronting the enabling condition of the whole case, which was the easy domestic availability of arsenic in those years. Arsenic in that period was present in ordinary households, in a variety of common preparations, in weed killers used upon garden paths, in tonics and medicines, and in the vermin killers kept against rats and mice. It could be obtained without great difficulty, and it was present, in one form or another, in the outbuildings and cupboards of comfortable suburban homes, as a matter of course. This ready availability meant that the presence of arsenic within reach of the family established nothing in itself, for such poisons were within reach of a great many respectable households, and it removed from the investigators the simple line of inquiry that a rare or difficult poison would have offered. The statements were taken and compared, the movements of each person reconstructed as far as recollection permitted, the medical men questioned as to what they had seen and what they had first concluded. The doctors who had attended the deaths had to account for the diagnoses of natural causes and gastric influenza that the toxicology had now overturned, and their evidence became part of the growing file. Yet for all the thoroughness with which the questioning was conducted, the investigation ran into the wall that the nature of the case had built against it from the start. There was no single unlawful act that could be witnessed or reconstructed, no moment at which a hand was seen to add anything to soup or tonic, and no physical trace that pointed unambiguously to one person rather than another. As the inquiry proceeded, the attention of the investigators came to rest upon those within the family circle who had possessed both the access that the constant dining afforded and an expectation of benefit from the deaths. 2 people in particular were, in the surviving files and in the accounts that have come down from the investigation, the people toward whom the evidence was felt to point, because they answered to both of those conditions. They were Grace Duff, the married daughter, and Tom Sidney, the son, sister, and brother within the one family. Neither of them was ever charged with any offence, neither of them was ever brought to trial. They must be understood throughout only as persons whom the evidence was felt to point toward, and who were, in the course of the inquiry and the inquests, publicly questioned, and never as the poisoner, for the poisoner was never established in law. The police files, as they have survived and as they have been described, did not settle even upon a single theory of how these two persons stood in relation to the deaths. At certain points, the documents inclined toward a theory that the two had acted in concert, a brother and sister conspiring together in the destruction of their own family for the expectations that would fall to them. At other points, and in the later stages, the inclination of the file shifted toward Greystuff alone. The record of the investigation thus appears to move between these positions rather than to rest firmly upon either, and this shifting is itself a fact of the case, for it shows that even the officers who conducted the inquiry did not arrive at a fixed and provable conclusion. No theory advanced within the file was ever carried to the point of a charge. The investigation, for all its length and thoroughness, produced no arrest. No one was taken into custody, no one was placed before a magistrate, and no committal for trial ever followed from the work of Scotland Yard upon the Croydon deaths. The exhumations had established the cause, the questioning had mapped the household and its habits, and the suspicion of the officers had come to rest upon persons within the family. But between suspicion and proof there lay a gap that the evidence could not close. The file was worked and reworked, and in the end it was closed, and it was closed without a name attached to the crime that the toxicology had proved. The medical evidence upon which the whole case rested was the work of the analysts who examined the exhumed remains. The cause of death in each of the three cases was determined to be acute arsenical poisoning, established not by the observations made at the bedsides, which had produced only the mistaken attributions of natural causes and gastric influenza, but by the chemical analysis conducted after the bodies had been raised. Arsenic was recovered from all three sets of remains, and it was recovered in quantities that accounted for the deaths. The medical finding was therefore not a matter of inference from symptoms, but of substance recovered and measured, and it was upon that firm ground that the coroner's proceedings would afterwards stand. The examination of the remains was conducted by the analysts of the Home Office, the chemists and pathologists to whom such work was referred in cases of suspected poisoning. The naming of the particular medical men associated with the case cannot be stated with certainty from the record available for this account, and the examinations are therefore best attributed to the Home Office analysts who undertook the toxicological work. What can be stated is that the work was done, that it was done upon all three bodies, and that in each case it returned the same answer. The original attributions of the deaths, natural causes in the one instance, and gastric influenza in the other, were overturned by that analysis and could not survive it. The findings bore out the accounts that had been given of the deaths themselves. The gritty and foul taste that Violet Sidney had complained of on taking her tonic was consistent with a large dose of arsenic present in the medicine, for arsenic taken in quantity could impart just such a character to what was swallowed. The rapid collapse that had followed, and the severe gastric illness that had marked each of the three deaths were consistent with acute arsenical poisoning, which acts upon the body swiftly and severely when taken in a sufficient dose. The medical evidence, then, did not merely establish the presence of the poison, it fitted the presence of the poison to the observed course of each death, and it made of the three deaths a single medical pattern. That pattern, once established by the analysts, became the foundation of everything that followed, for it converted three deaths that had been separately explained into three cases of arsenical poisoning within one family across a single year. The medical examination could establish the cause of death, and it could establish that the cause was the same in each case, but it could not establish the hand that had administered the poison, for the analysis of a body reveals the substance within it, and not the person who placed it there. The limit of the medical evidence was therefore the limit of the whole case, and it was a limit that the proceedings to come would not overpass. Those proceedings took the form of the coroner's inquest, and it is in the inquests that the case chiefly lived, and by which it chiefly became known. 3 separate coroner's inquests were held, one into the death of Edmund Duff, one into the death of Vera Sidney, and one into the death of Violet Sidney. They were held at the Croydon Coroner's Court, and they ran, across their several sessions to a great length, extending over roughly 26 sittings of the court. This was an extraordinary number of sessions for a coroner's inquiry, and it reflected both the gravity of what was alleged and the difficulty of what was being examined, for the court sat again and again over the deaths, taking evidence at a length that few inquests before it had required. The inquests were conducted before the coroner in open court, and they were attended by the national press and by crowds who filled the room. The naming of the coroner who presided cannot be stated with certainty from the record available for this account, and he is therefore referred to only by his office. What can be stated is that the proceedings over which he presided drew an attention altogether out of proportion to the ordinary business of a coroner's court. For the newspapers reported the sittings at length, and the public sought places in the room, so that the examination of the Croydon deaths was conducted before a national audience across many weeks. The feature of the inquests that fixed them in the memory, and that was without precedent in the ordinary run of such proceedings, was that the surviving members of the family sat in the same room and listened to one another, questioned as suspects. The court did not confine itself to the medical cause of death. It opened in public the finances of the family, the movements of its members about the several households, the marriages and the domestic arrangements, and the contents of the medicine cupboards. Grace Duff and Tom Sidney, the two toward whom the evidence had been felt to point, were questioned in open court while their relatives sat by, and the intimate affairs of a respectable family were laid before the coroner, the press, and the public in a manner that such families had always been at the greatest pains to prevent. The questioning ranged across every matter that might bear upon the deaths. The expectations of benefit that attended the 3 deaths were examined, for the small legacies and annuities and expectations that made up the family's means were now matters of evidence rather than of private arrangement. The movements of each person on the days when the 3 had fallen ill were gone over, the meals reconstructed, the handling of the soup and of the tonic traced as far as the witnesses could carry it. The cook, Mrs. Noakes, who had eaten of the same soup as Vera and had herself been taken ill, gave her account of the kitchen and the dish, and her illness and the death of the cat became part of the record laid before the court. Across the 26 sittings, the coroner's courts assembled a great body of evidence, and yet at the end of it, the same wall stood that had stopped the police. The medical evidence established arsenic, and established it in all 3. The questioning established access, and it established expectation of benefit in the 2 toward whom suspicion pointed. But nothing that was placed before the coroner established the hand that had administered the poison. The inquests could examine, and they could examine exhaustively and in public, but they could not manufacture the proof that neither the scene nor the analysis had yielded. And so the proceedings moved, session by session, toward verdicts that would name the crime without naming the criminal. The verdicts, when they came, were verdicts of willful murder. The coroner's juries found that the deaths in the Sidney cases were willful murder by arsenical poisoning, and the finding of murder was extended across the family deaths, so that what had been buried as natural causes and as gastric influenza was now formally recorded as murder. But the verdicts named no person. In each case the finding was of willful murder by arsenic against a person or persons unknown, and no one was named in the verdict, and no one was committed for trial upon it. The juries had gone as far as the evidence would carry them, to the fact of murder, and no further, for the identity of the murderer had not been established and could not be declared. That the inquests could return murder against a person or persons unknown, and yet commit no one, marked the outer limit of what the coroner's court could do. The inquest was an instrument for establishing how a person had come by death, and in the Croydon cases it had established that 3 persons had come by their deaths through arsenic willfully administered. But the inquest was not a court of trial, and it could not, upon the evidence before it, transform its suspicion into a charge. The surviving family members walked out of the court in which they had sat and been questioned, none of them named in the verdict, and none of them committed, and the proceedings that had run to 26 sittings closed without fastening the crime upon anyone. Because no one had been named and no one committed, there was no trial. This must be stated plainly, for the length and the drama of the inquests might suggest that a prosecution followed, and none did. No person was ever charged with the murder of Edmund Duff, of Vera Sidney, or of Violet Sidney. No indictment was laid, no prisoner stood in a dock, and no jury of trial was ever sworn to try the question of guilt. The whole of the case's public life was contained in the exhumations, the analysis, and the inquests, and beyond the coroner's court it did not pass into any court of trial, for there was never the charge. That alone could have carried it there. Because there was no charge and no trial, there was no sentence. No person was convicted of the Croydon deaths, and so no person was sentenced for them. No term of imprisonment was passed, and no capital sentence was pronounced, for the law can pass no sentence where it has secured no conviction. The 3 deaths, formally recorded now as wilful murder, produced no penalty upon any living person, and the case entered its aftermath with the crime established and the criminal at large and unnamed. This absence of any legal conclusion is the defining fact of the case's ending, and it was as true at the close of the inquests as it remains in the historical record. The immediate aftermath of the inquests was a period of intense national press coverage that ran through the year 1929. The newspapers, which had reported the 26 sittings at length, carried the spectacle of a respectable family that had been publicly suspected and publicly questioned, and had emerged from the coroner's court under a suspicion that no verdict had lifted and no charge had resolved. The members of the family had been examined in open court as to their finances, their movements, and their households, and though none had been named in a verdict, none had been cleared by one either, and they carried out of the proceedings a notoriety that attached to them without the finality that either conviction or acquittal would have brought. That was the peculiar cruelty of the case's outcome for those who survived it, and it was a cruelty of a strictly factual kind, requiring no interpretation to state. A charge, had it been brought, would have led to a trial, and a trial would have led to a verdict, and a verdict would have either convicted or acquitted, and so have settled the matter one way or the other. The inquests brought none of these. They brought a finding of murder against persons unknown, and they left the surviving family beneath a public suspicion that had been aired in the fullest possible manner, and then closed without resolution. The family had been examined as thoroughly as any accused persons, and released as no accused person is released, without the judgment that examination is meant to produce. In the wake of the proceedings, the family did not remain together in the quarter where the deaths had occurred. Grace Duff eventually left Croydon, departing the district of Birdhurst Rise, where her mother and sister had died, and where she herself had been questioned in open court. The family, which had lived so closely clustered in the villa quarter of South Croydon, dining daily between its several houses, scattered from the place that the deaths and the inquests had made notorious. The habit of constant intimate dining that had bound the households together, and that had been the field of the whole inquiry, could not survive the year, and the family circle that had gathered so tightly in that quarter came apart. The later lives of the two toward whom the evidence had been felt to point may be stated only briefly and strictly as fact, for neither was ever charged and neither may be described as anything other than a person who had been publicly questioned. Grace Duff lived on for a great many years after the Croydon deaths. The year of her death cannot be stated with certainty from the record available for this account, but she survived into old age, decades beyond the events at Birdhurst Rise, and she is reported to have given, late in her life, an interview in which she maintained her innocence. Tom Sidney also lived on after the case. Neither of them was ever charged with any offence in connection with the deaths, and the suspicion under which they had passed through the inquests was never converted into a proceeding at law. either against them or against anyone else. The identity of the poisoner was never established, and it has remained unestablished from that day to this. What the years after the inquests produced was not a solution, but a literature, for the case, having defeated the coroner and the yard, passed into the body of British true crime writing and became one of its permanent subjects. Successive writers took up the Croydon deaths and advanced rival explanations of them, and the contest among those explanations became the chief afterlife of the case. But the contest is an interpretive one only. The record supports no one of the rival theories as proven, and the case stands in the historical record as permanently open, examined again and again, and settled never. The most substantial treatments of the case are two book-length studies written decades apart. The first is the account by Richard Whittington Egan, published in 1975 under the title The Riddle of Birdhurst Rise, which took the Croydon poisoning mystery as its subject and became the classic narrative of the case. The second is the work of Diane Janes, published in 2010 under the title Poisonous Lies, a modern and careful reinvestigation of the same deaths. Each of these works reaches conclusions of its own, and each names a culprit according to its own reading of the evidence. But the identification advanced in each is the argument of its author, and not a matter established in law or in fact. The later writers each name a different figure, and none can prove the naming, and so the two books stand as rival readings rather than as a shared solution. Beyond these two studies, the case has been treated in numerous British true crime anthologies, in which it is regularly cited as a benchmark unsolved poisoning case, the example to which writers turn when they wish to describe a domestic arsenic mystery that was never solved. It has received occasional treatment in documentary and television form as well. In discussions of the period, it is sometimes set beside the fascination with poison that marked the fiction of the interwar years, the era in which the poisoning mystery flourished upon the page. Though that association is a matter of atmosphere and of the taste of the time, rather than of any direct connection to the Croydon deaths themselves, and it is best left as context and not pressed into a link that the record does not support. The place the case holds in the historical record is a settled one, for it is remembered as the most notorious unsolved poisoning case in England, the textbook example of a domestic arsenic mystery that defeated both the coroner and Scotland Yard. Its notoriety rests not upon any solution, for it has none, but upon the completeness of its resistance to solution. 3 deaths in one family were established as arsenical murder. The household was examined to its foundations across 26 sittings of a coroner's court. The suspicion of the investigators came to rest upon named persons within the family, and still no charge was ever brought, and no crime ever fastened upon anyone. It is that combination of a murder fully proved and an offender never named that has kept the case in the literature and made it the standard by which other unsolved poisonings are measured. The significance of the case lies also in what it demonstrated about the inquest as an instrument of the law. The extraordinary spectacle of a whole respectable family publicly examined as suspects across dozens of sittings, with the finances and movements and medicine cupboards of its members opened in open court, and with no charge resulting from any of it, stands as a landmark in the limits of the coroner's court. The inquest could establish that murder had been done, and it could examine, exhaustively and in public, everyone who might have done it, but it could not, upon the evidence available, carry its finding into a charge, and the Croydon proceedings showed with unusual clarity the point at which the power of such a court ended. The case survives richly in the record, in the transcripts of the inquests, in the surviving archive and police files, and in the extensive contemporary press, so that little of it is truly lost, and the completeness of the record has served only to sharpen, rather than to resolve, the question at its centre. That question sits within its own period, in the England of the years between the wars, and it must be understood in the terms of that period and no other. The deaths occurred in the interwar suburban England of 1928 and 1929 in the respectable, church-going, servant-keeping middle class of a prosperous Surrey town, among people much concerned with status, with money, and with the maintenance of appearances. It was a society in which the outward forms of respectability were guarded with particular care, and in which the public examination of a family's private affairs was a thing of the greatest shame, so that the very publicity of the inquests fell upon the survivors as a punishment of its own, distinct from any that the law might have imposed. The setting is essential to the case, for it was the world of the comfortable suburban household, with its shared meals and its bottled tonics and its cupboards of common poisons, that made the deaths both possible and, in the end, unprovable. The Croydon of that year was a town that had only recently completed its transformation from an old market centre into a modern suburban borough, and its character in 1929 was that of a place proud of its own respectability and its own municipal substance. It had its own borough council, its own police arrangements bound into the wider policing of the county and the capital, its own hospitals and its own courts, and a population that had swelled with the families of professional men, of retired officials, and of persons of independent means, who had settled in its southern districts for the quiet and the air. The villa quarters of South Croydon were the outward sign of that settlement, and the households that kept them were households in which the forms of a comfortable life were observed with exactness. The meals taken at their hours, the servants kept to their duties, and the visiting between relatives conducted with the regularity of a settled custom. Within such households, the practice of medicine was in large part a domestic practice, conducted at home and by habit long before any doctor was called. The taking of tonics and prepared medicines was a fixed part of the daily routine of persons of Vera Sidney's generation and station, and a bottle of such a preparation upon the sideboard was as ordinary an object as the tea service or the cruet. These tonics were taken as a matter of course for the general maintenance of health rather than against any named illness, and they were taken without thought or ceremony, poured and swallowed in the middle of an ordinary meal. It was into precisely this unremarkable domestic routine that the poison entered, and it was the very ordinariness of the tonic bottle, an object handled daily and suspected never, that made it so terrible an instrument once it had been corrupted. The same was true of the food that passed between the kitchens of the family. Soup prepared in one household and shared at the table, or carried in a jug from one house to another, was among the commonest of the courtesies that bound the family together, and it was accepted and eaten without any thought that it might carry harm. The kitchen of a comfortable household was the province of the cook, and the movements of dishes from stove to table and from house to house were the small, unremarked traffic of daily life, watched by no one because there was no reason to watch. When the investigators came afterwards to reconstruct that traffic, they were attempting to fix with precision a set of movements that had been made without any expectation that they would ever need to be remembered, and the difficulty of that reconstruction was one of the case's abiding obstacles. When illness came into such a household, the first response was domestic, and only after the domestic response had failed was the doctor summoned. A sudden gastric illness, of the kind that seized each of the three, was not in itself a thing to excite alarm, for illnesses of the stomach were common, and were commonly ascribed to something that had disagreed, to a chill or to one of the seasonal fevers that passed through the population in the colder months. The very familiarity of such symptoms was what allowed the first two deaths to be assigned to natural causes and to gastric influenza without suspicion. For a doctor called to a patient in violent gastric distress had every ordinary reason to reach for an ordinary explanation, and no reason, in a respectable household with no history of trouble, to reach for the extraordinary one of poison. The influenza to which Vera Sidney's death was ascribed was itself a thing much in the minds of doctors and families in those years, for the memory of the great influenza that had swept the world at the close of the war was still fresh, and gastric forms of influenza were a recognised and dreaded visitation. To attribute a sudden and fatal gastric collapse to influenza was therefore not a careless diagnosis, but a plausible one, drawn from the medical understanding and the recent experience of the time. It was only the third death, and the analysis that followed it, that revealed how completely the plausible explanation had covered the true one, and that turned the doctor's reasonable diagnoses into errors that the toxicology was obliged to correct. The coroner's court in which the case was at last examined was itself an institution of a particular character, older in its form than the modern police it worked beside, and charged with the ancient duty of inquiring into deaths that were sudden, violent, or unexplained. Its business was ordinarily brief, the great majority of the deaths that came before it disposed of in a single sitting, with a verdict of death by natural causes, or by misadventure, or by accident, and the court passing on to the next matter. That the Croydon inquests should have run to some 26 sittings was therefore a measure of how far outside the ordinary business of the court these deaths lay, and the length of the proceedings, spread across weeks, was itself a kind of public event. Each fresh sitting reported and awaited, the court become for a season the stage upon which the affairs of a single family were played out before the nation. The crowds that pressed for places in that court, and the columns that the newspapers gave over to its sittings, were drawn by a combination of elements that the case possessed in an unusual degree. Here was poison, the most secret and domestic of the means of murder, and here was arsenic in particular, the poison most steeped in the associations of the poisoning cases of the past. Here was a respectable family of the comfortable classes, the very sort of family that was supposed to be beyond such things, examined in open court as to its most private affairs. And here, above all, was the spectacle of relatives seated together while one another were questioned, the intimate bonds of a family turned into the material of a public inquiry. The combination was one that the press of the period found irresistible, and the reporting carried the names of the family and the details of the deaths into households across the country. Yet beneath the spectacle, the substance of the matter remained what it had been from the first, a set of deaths proved to be murder and incapable of being fastened upon any hand. The publicity could not supply what the evidence lacked, and the more thoroughly the affairs of the family were exposed, the more plainly it appeared that exposure alone would yield no answer. Every sitting added to the record, and none added the one thing that a charge would have required, and the proceedings advanced toward their verdicts of murder against persons unknown with the outcome, in truth, settled from the beginning by the nature of the evidence. However long, the examination was prolonged. The material availability of the poison sat beneath the whole of it as the enabling fact, and in the England of those years, it was a fact of ordinary domestic life. Preparations containing arsenic could be had for the killing of weeds upon a garden path, for the destruction of rats and other vermin about a house and its outbuildings, and in various tonics and compounds of the kind kept in domestic cupboards, and they could be obtained without any great difficulty by persons who had lawful and everyday reasons to possess them. A comfortable suburban household with a garden and outbuildings was precisely the sort of place in which such preparations might be found as a matter of course, and their presence within reach of the family therefore proved nothing against any member of it, for they were within reach of a great many respectable families who never came to any harm at all. This ordinariness of the poison was the last and the most intractable of the obstacles that stood between the murder and its solution. Had the arsenic been a rare substance, difficult to obtain and traceable to a particular purchase, the record of its acquisition might have pointed toward a single hand. But arsenic in that period left no such trail, for it was everywhere that comfortable domestic life was lived, in the shed and the cupboard and the medicine bottle, and the question was never where the poison could have come from, but who, among those with equal and innocent access to it, had turned it to the purpose of murder. It was a question the evidence could pose with terrible clarity and could not answer, and it is the question in which the case has rested, undisturbed and unresolved, from the closing of the inquests to the present state of the record. The identity of the poisoner was not established. No conviction followed. None was ever sought. That is where the record of the first case ends. We turn now to a second story, quieter than the one before it and far less remembered. One that unfolded a decade earlier and many miles from the suburbs of the capital, in a small market town where the shopkeepers knew their customers by name and kept their takings close. It is a case of a different kind, without poison and without a long family table, and yet it turned upon the same question that no inquest could finally answer. The record of it is thin in places, and where it is thin, it will be left thin. But what survives is enough to follow from the beginning. The case of Elizabeth Ridgely begins in Hitchin, Hertfordshire, in the last week of January in the year 1919. Hitchin at that time was a market town of some 10 to 11,000 people, set in the arable country of North Hertfordshire, roughly 35 miles from London along the Great Northern Line, and it had the settled character of a place that had grown slowly and traded steadily for centuries. Its centre held a broad market square, a parish church of considerable age, and streets of brick and plaster that ran out gradually into lanes and open fields. The town had long dealt in corn and in wool, in lavender grown on the surrounding chalk, and in the ordinary commerce of a country town that served the farms and villages around it. It was neither poor nor prosperous beyond the average, a place of small businesses, of tradesmen and labourers, of families that had lived within a few streets of one another for generations. The winter of that year was a hard one, and the town lay under heavy snow through the final days of January. The war had ended some 10 weeks earlier, in the November of 1918, and the country was in the unsettled condition that followed it. Soldiers were returning from the front in large numbers and being demobilised into towns that had no immediate work for all of them. There was hardship, and there were men on the roads and in the lodging houses who had no fixed occupation, and the ordinary rhythm of the town had not yet recovered its pre-war steadiness. In Hitchin, as in every English town of the period, the return of the men was both a relief and a strain, and the winter weather pressed down upon a community already worn by 4 years of loss. Nightingale Road lay a little away from the market square, a residential street of modest terraced houses running through a working part of the town. It was the kind of street where the ground floor of a dwelling might be given over to a small general shop, its front room fitted with a counter and shelves, its window displaying the goods that a neighbourhood required from day to day. Such shops were the ordinary machinery of working life in that period. They sold tea and sugar and tinned goods, tobacco and matches, sweets and small necessaries, and they extended credit to regular customers and kept the accounts in a book. They opened early and closed late, and the person who kept them commonly lived in the rooms above and behind, so that the shop and the home were one premises and one life. It was such a shop that Elizabeth Ridgely kept converted from the ground floor of her house on Nightingale Road, and it was there that she lived, and there that she traded. She was 54 years of age in that winter, a widow who bore her late husband's surname, and she had kept the shop and lived upon its trade for some time. The detailed record of her earlier life is thin. The birthplace, the parentage, the circumstances of her marriage, and her widowhood are not established with any fullness in the surviving accounts, and where the record is silent, it will not be filled. What is known is what her neighbours knew, the woman as she appeared in the ordinary course of the street, and it is from that ordinary course that the account must be drawn. She lived alone in the premises, but for a dog, an Irish terrier, which was kept about the shop, and which was known to the customers who came and went. She was regarded in the neighbourhood as a kindly woman, though careful and somewhat nervous in her manner, the sort of shopkeeper who was attentive to her customers and cautious in her habits. Among those habits was one that would later be weighed with particular attention. She did not bank the week's takings in the ordinary way. She drew the money from the till and kept it about the premises, upon her person, or in the rooms she occupied, rather than depositing it with a bank. This was not an uncommon practice among small tradespeople of the period, for the banking habit had not fully reached the working shopkeeper, and cash held on the premises was a familiar thing. But it meant that a sum of money was known, or could be supposed to be kept within the walls of the shop, and that supposition would come to bear upon the case. The life of a corner shopkeeper in a country town, in that winter, was a life of small and repeated tasks. The shop was opened in the morning, the shutters or blinds taken down, the counter made ready. Through the day the neighbours came, for a £1/4 of this and an ounce of that, for a paper of pins or a twist of tobacco, and the day's small transactions were entered and the small sums taken. In the evening the shop was closed, the blinds drawn, the door secured, and the takings gathered up. It was a solitary life for a widow living alone, but it was not an unusual one, and there is nothing in the record to suggest that Elizabeth Ridgely's days differed from the days of 100 other shopkeepers in 100 other towns. She served her customers, she kept her dog, she held her money close, and she closed her door at night upon the street and the weather. The town about her went on in its winter way. The snow lay in the streets and was banked against the walls, and the cold of that late January was severe. The demobilised men came and went, some returning to their families and their old employment, some without either, drifting through the lodging houses and the public houses of the district. The shops closed early against the weather and the dark, and the streets emptied in the evenings as people kept indoors against the cold. It was into such an evening, at the end of such an ordinary day, that the event which is the subject of this account took place. The last documented moment of Elizabeth Ridgely being alive is placed on a bitterly cold evening in the last week of January in the year 1919, at an hour after the shop would ordinarily have closed to its regular trade. The accounts place it between roughly 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the evening. At about that hour, it was afterwards established, someone entered the shop. The precise date has been the subject of some difference in the record. The catalogue of the National Archives dates the murder to the 25th of January. The body was not found until some 2 days later. Certain secondary accounts have placed the matter into the following month. The safe form, and the form this account will keep to, is that the crime occurred in the last week of January in the year 1919, and that the premises stood shut and undisturbed for roughly 2 days before the discovery was made. Beyond that, the exact evening cannot be fixed with certainty from the record as it survives. What is established is that a person came to the shop after its ordinary closing, at an hour when the street was dark and cold and empty, and that Elizabeth Ridgely admitted that person, or was in some manner present when that person entered. It was the last time she was known to be living. From that hour, the shop was silent. The blinds remained drawn, the door remained shut, and the premises gave no sign to the street of what had occurred within them. To the neighbours passing in the snow, a shop with its blinds down in bitter weather was not at first a thing to remark upon, for the cold had shut many doors, and a widow keeping indoors against the weather was an ordinary sight, and so for the better part of 2 days the matter lay undiscovered, the street going on past the closed shop without alarm, the snow continuing to fall, the town continuing in its winter quiet, while behind the drawn blinds the shop kept its silence. It is worth setting down, before the discovery is reached, the manner in which such a shop stood in relation to its street, for it bears upon how the thing could go unremarked so long. The shop front gave directly upon the pavement, its window and its door the only openings to public view, and when the blinds were drawn, the interior was wholly hidden. A customer finding the shop shut in the daytime would suppose the keeper out upon an errand, or unwell, or simply closed for the day, and would come again later or go elsewhere for the small thing wanted. There was no telephone in such a premises, no ready means by which absence would be noticed and reported. The keeper answered to no employer and kept to no fixed hours but her own, and a day or two of a shut shop in hard weather raised no immediate question. This ordinary invisibility of a small shopkeeper's life. The very privacy that made it a life of independence was also the thing that allowed 2 days to pass. By the second day, however, the continued closure began to be noticed. Customers who had come and found the shop shut came again and found it shut still. The blinds had not been raised, the door had not been opened, and the woman who was ordinarily to be found behind her counter had not been seen. The dog, ordinarily heard or seen about the premises, was not in evidence. A shop that stays shut past the point of ordinary explanation begins to draw attention in a street where the keeper is known, and by degrees the closed door on Nightingale Road became a matter of concern among the neighbours. Some spoke of it to one another. The absence, at first unremarkable, had lasted too long to remain so, and the concern of the street at length reached the point at which the police were informed. The informing of the police brought a constable to Nightingale Road, and it is at this point that the premises were at last entered. The account of the discovery names the officer who forced his way in as a constable of the borough, recorded in the local histories as Police Constable Alf Kirby, though the name is held at only moderate confidence in the surviving record. The door had been secured from within, and the blinds remained down, as they had been for the 2 days past, and there was no answer to be had from without. The constable, finding no other means, forced an entry into the shop. What he found upon entering was the body of Elizabeth Ridgely within the premises, and near her the body of her dog, both dead. The shop had stood as it was left, closed against the street, for the better part of 2 days, and the cold had held the rooms in its own preservation through that time. The scene that the constable came upon was one of violence done within an enclosed and ordinary room. The woman had suffered severe injuries to the head, injuries of a kind that had been rapidly fatal, and the dog had been killed by blows of the same character. Between the two bodies there lay a shop weight, a 4-pound weight of the sort kept upon the counter for the weighing of goods, and it bore the marks of what had been done. The till had been emptied of its contents. To the eye of anyone who considered the room as a whole, the arrangement of these things told a plain story. A woman known to keep money on her premises had been struck down. Her dog with her, a heavy object lay at hand, and the money was gone. It was, on its face, a robbery that had ended in death, and a death that had been dealt with the first heavy thing that came to hand. That, however, is not the conclusion that was first reached. The discovery of the bodies brought the local constabulary to the premises, and the examination that the local officers made of the scene led them to a determination that would afterwards become the defining feature of the whole case. They concluded that no murder had been committed at all. Their reading of the scene was that Elizabeth Ridgely had met with an accident within her own premises, that she had fallen upon the stairs or within the shop, and had died of the injuries of that fall, and that the death of the dog was to be explained in the confusion of the same event. Upon that reading, there was no crime to investigate. The matter was, in effect, treated as a domestic misadventure, an old woman's fall in an empty house, and the machinery of a murder investigation was not set in motion. It is difficult, in the plain setting out of the record, to convey how much followed from that first determination, and yet the record requires that it be set down without embellishment. The first hours after the discovery of a body are the hours in which the evidence of a crime is freshest and most recoverable. It is in those hours that the position of things is undisturbed, that marks and stains are clearest, that the memories of witnesses are nearest to the event. When the local officers concluded that no crime had been committed, they did not preserve the scene as the scene of a crime. The premises were treated as the premises of an accident. Things were moved, the room was cleared and cleaned, and the particular arrangement of objects that a murder investigation would have recorded and photographed and preserved was not so recorded nor preserved. The 4-pound weight, the emptied till, the position of the bodies, the state of the door and the blinds, all of these passed out of their first condition before any hand trained to read them had read them. The dog is the detail upon which the accident theory broke, though it did not break at once. A woman may fall upon a stair and die of the injury, and such deaths were common enough in that period and raised no suspicion of themselves. But the same explanation cannot easily be extended to cover a dog killed by blows of the same kind in the same room upon the same evening. An accidental fall does not account for a second body, an animal struck down by the same violence, the presence of the dead terrier beside its mistress, both dead of head injuries, both in the same enclosed room, was a fact that the accident theory could not absorb, and it was this above all that would trouble the reconsideration of the case when reconsideration at last came. For a time, however, the matter rested upon the local finding. It was public concern, the disquiet of a town that did not accept that one of its shopkeepers had merely fallen, that would not let the finding stand. Word of the death passed through Hitchin, and with it a growing unease that the explanation offered did not fit the thing that had happened. A woman who kept her money on her premises, found dead with her till emptied and her dog killed beside her, was not in the common sense of her neighbours the victim of a simple fall. The murmuring of the town, the refusal of the ordinary people who had known her to be satisfied, mounted to a pressure that the authorities could not indefinitely resist. It was that pressure, and not the initiative of the local force, that reopened the question. When the question was reopened, it was placed in other hands. The Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard were called upon to send a detective, as was the practice when a provincial force found a case beyond its ordinary compass, or when the handling of a matter had come into doubt. The officer who came down from London was the Scotland Yard detective, Frederick Wensley, a man whose name carried a considerable weight in the police world of that time. He had served long in the East End of London, had policed the streets of Whitechapel as a young constable in the years of the Ripper murders, and had made his reputation over the following decades in the breaking of the criminal gangs of the East End. He was known by the sobriquet of Whitechapel's Sherlock Holmes, a genuine name of the period, and he came to Hitchin as a man of established skill in the reconstruction of crimes. It is recorded that he came down in the February of 1919, which is to say some days, and perhaps a week or more, after the death. Here the whole difficulty of the case declares itself. Wensley came to a scene that no longer existed as a scene. The premises had been examined upon the accident theory, cleared and disturbed, the bodies removed, the objects handled, the room returned toward its ordinary state. The 2 days during which the shop had stood shut, and the further days during which the local finding had held, had passed, and with them had passed the freshness upon which a reconstruction depends. The stains that might have been mapped, the objects that might have been fixed in their places, the traces that might have been lifted, were compromised or gone. The witnesses who might have been questioned while the evening was near to them had been left unquestioned, and their memories had begun the ordinary work of fading and of settling into fixed and perhaps mistaken shapes. Wensley was set to build a case out of the remains of an investigation that had been founded upon the belief that there was no case to build. That he built one at all is a measure of the man's method, and the record credits him with recovering what could still be recovered. He gathered what physical traces remained. He took the statements of those who could be found, and who had anything to tell, the neighbours, the customers, the people who had passed along Nightingale Road on the evening in question or in the days about it. He assembled the pattern of sightings, the accounts of who had been seen near the shop and at what hours, and he set these against the little that the compromised scene could still yield. From these materials he worked toward the identification of a person, and the person toward whom the reconstructed evidence pointed was a local man, an Irish labourer named John Healy. John Healy was a labouring man of the town, an Irishman by origin and a veteran of the war lately ended, and he was a man of a documented history of violence. He had been about the district, and there were those who placed him in the vicinity, and there was said to be upon his clothing and his boots a staining that drew the suspicion of the investigators. Upon these things, the sightings, the history, the alleged marks upon his dress, the reconstructed case against him was raised. it must be stated plainly, and it must be held to throughout what follows, that John Healey was in the end tried for this death and acquitted of it, and that the account which follows does not assert and cannot assert that he was the man who killed Elizabeth Ridgely. He was the man toward whom the surviving evidence was made to point, and the man who was in consequence brought to trial, and that is the whole of what the record establishes concerning him at this stage. The reconstruction that Wensley assembled was, of its nature, a circumstantial one. There was no witness who had seen the blow struck, no confession, no single piece of evidence that fixed the death upon one hand beyond dispute. There was the pattern of sightings that placed a man in the area at the material time. There was the character of the man, his known history of violent conduct. There was the matter of the staining upon his clothing and his boots, which the prosecution would afterwards seek to connect with the scene. And there was the shape of the crime itself, a robbery of a woman known to hold money, done with a weapon caught up on the spot, which fitted the supposition of a man in the hardship of that post-war winter, who knew or guessed where money was kept. From these strands the case was woven, and upon them the arrest was made, and the committal sought. The medical facts of the death, so far as the record permits them to be stated, were established by the examination of the body. A post-mortem examination was conducted, and the cause of death was determined to be the head injuries that had been inflicted, injuries consistent with heavy blows and consistent with the 4-pound shop weight that had been found between the two bodies. The injuries were severe and had been rapidly fatal. The medical evidence bore directly upon the discredited accident theory, for the character of the injuries, weighed together with the identical manner in which the dog had been killed, was not consistent with a fall. A woman does not sustain such injuries in the ordinary course of a fall upon a stair, and a dog is not killed by a fall at all. The medical finding, when it was properly weighed, became a central plank of the case that the death had been no accident but a killing, and it stood in flat contradiction to the conclusion with which the local officers had begun. The coroner's inquest was convened in the ordinary course, as the law required upon a death of this character, and it was before the inquest that the matter completed its passage from the accident finding to the finding of a wilful killing. An inquest is an inquiry into the fact and the cause and the circumstances of a death, held before the coroner and, in a case of this kind, before a jury. The evidence of the discovery was heard, and the medical evidence of the cause of death was heard, and the inquest weighed the death, not as a misadventure, but as a crime. The passage of the matter through the coroner's court is the point at which the accident theory was formally set aside, and the death entered upon the record as a murder, and it was upon that footing that the committal proceedings and the trial went forward. The precise wording of the coroner's verdict and the name of the coroner who presided are held at only moderate confidence in the surviving record, and are attributed here in the general form the record permits. The committal proceedings followed, held before the magistrates in the ordinary way, at which the evidence gathered by Wensley was laid before the bench to determine whether there was a case fit to be sent for trial. The magistrates, having heard the circumstantial case, the sightings, the history, the alleged staining, the reconstruction of the robbery, and the killing, determined that John Healey should be committed for trial upon the charge of the murder of Elizabeth Ridgely. He was accordingly committed to take his trial at the assizes and was held to await it. The matter thus passed out of the hands of the police and the magistrates and into the hands of the court that would try it, and the reconstruction that had been raised upon the ruins of the first investigation was to be tested before a judge and a jury. The trial commenced at the Hertford Assizes in the June of 1919, some 5 months after the death, before a judge of assize and a jury of the county. The assizes were the courts at which the graver criminal charges were tried, held periodically in the county town by judges who travelled a circuit for the purpose, and a charge of murder was among the gravest that came before them. John Healey was arraigned upon the charge of the wilful murder of Elizabeth Ridgely, and he pleaded not guilty, and the trial proceeded upon that plea. The Crown was represented by counsel who had the conduct of the prosecution, and the prisoner was defended by counsel appointed to his cause, and the case was opened to the jury in the ordinary manner. The case for the Crown was the circumstantial case that had been built out of the reconstruction. It was laid before the jury that a woman known to keep money upon her premises had been robbed and killed within her own shop upon a winter evening. It was laid before them that the prisoner had been seen in the vicinity, that he was a man of a violent history, and that upon his clothing and his boots there was staining which the prosecution sought to connect with the scene of the death. The pattern of sightings was put in evidence, the accounts of those who placed a man near the shop at the material hours. The medical evidence of the cause of death was given, the injuries severe and rapidly fatal, and consistent with the weight found at the scene. The whole was offered to the jury as a chain of circumstance, which taken together pointed to the prisoner as the man who had done the thing. But the case for the Crown carried within it, from the first, the weakness of its own origin, and it was upon that weakness that the defence fastened. For the evidence that the prosecution laid before the jury was not the evidence of a scene worked fresh by trained hands in the first hours. It was the evidence of a scene that had first been read as an accident, cleared and disturbed upon that reading, and reconstructed only afterwards, when the freshest and surest traces were already lost. Every strand of the circumstantial case had passed through that compromised beginning. The sightings had been gathered from memories left too long unquestioned. The physical traces had survived the clearing of a room that no one had at first thought to preserve. The chain the Crown offered was a chain forged after the event from what the event had left, and the defence had only to show the jury where each link had been weakened. Counsel for the defence pressed exactly that argument. The whole of the case, it was urged, rested upon a foundation that had been fatally compromised in the first hours after the discovery. The scene had not been preserved, the evidence had not been secured while it was fresh, the witnesses had not been questioned while the evening was near to them. What the Crown now offered as proof was the salvage of a botched beginning, and salvage of that kind could not carry the certainty that a charge of murder required. The Crown, it was submitted, could not prove its case to the standard the law demanded, because the means of proving it had been destroyed before the investigation properly began. Upon such a foundation, the defence contended, no jury could safely convict. To this the defence joined a further contention, one that touched the character of the town and the position of the accused within it. John Healy was an Irishman in an English market town, and it was urged on his behalf that he had been fixed upon not because the evidence honestly led to him, but because he was a convenient figure for the suspicion of a place that wished its crime explained, and its stranger blamed. He was, the defence maintained, a man made a scapegoat, singled out by reason of his origin and his reputation, rather than by reason of any proof that he had lifted his hand against Elizabeth Ridgely. The anti-Irish feeling that ran as an undercurrent through English towns of that period was placed before the jury as the true explanation of the case against him. Whether that feeling had in fact directed the investigation, the record does not establish. That it was made the heart of the defence is established, and it was pressed with force. The trial ran its course through the evidence and the addresses of counsel and the summing up of the judge, who set before the jury the law they were to apply and the questions they were to answer. The burden lay upon the Crown to prove the charge, and to prove it so that the jury were sure of it, and the jury were directed that if the case fell short of that certainty, they were bound to acquit. With that direction, they retired to consider their verdict, carrying with them the whole of the circumstantial case and the whole of the defence that had been raised against it, the compromise scene, the salvaged evidence, the sightings drawn from stale memory, the staining, the history, and the contention that the man before them had been chosen for his origin. The jury did not deliberate long. They were absent from the court for a space recorded as about 11 minutes, and they returned to deliver their verdict. Upon the charge of the murder of Elizabeth Ridgely, they found John Healey not guilty. He was acquitted. The brevity of the deliberation, some 11 minutes upon a charge of murder, is a fact that the record preserves and that speaks for itself as to the weight the jury placed upon the case they had heard. A jury that is sure of guilt may take an hour or many hours to satisfy itself of the particulars. A jury that returns in 11 minutes with an acquittal has found the case before it wanting almost as soon as it has begun to weigh it. Whatever the reconstruction had recovered, it had not persuaded the 12 men who heard it. Upon the verdict, John Healey was discharged. There was no sentence, for there was no conviction, and the man who had been committed and tried left the court a free man. The record says little more of him. What became of him afterwards, where he went and how he lived out his remaining years, is not established in the accessible account, and it will not be supplied by conjecture. He walked out of the assize court at Hertford in the June of 1919, acquitted of the charge, and the record closes over him almost at once. He is remembered only as the man toward whom the evidence was made to point, and whom a jury in the space of 11 minutes declined to convict. With the acquittal, the case against any named person was at an end. No one else was ever charged with the death of Elizabeth Ridgely. The reconstruction that Wensley had built had been the one attempt the law made to fix the crime upon a person, and it had failed at the last stage before the jury. There was no second suspect brought forward, no fresh line pursued to another door. The investigation, having spent itself upon the one man it had found, had nowhere further to go, and the matter lapsed. The death of Elizabeth Ridgely passed into the record as a murder without a murderer-in-law, a killing done within an ordinary shop upon a winter evening, for which no living person was ever held accountable before the court. The aftermath of the case, such as it was not personal but professional, and it belongs to the history of policing rather than to the history of the town alone. For the case became, in the years that followed, a byword among those who studied the investigation of crime. It stood as a demonstration, plain and complete, of a single principle. A scene mishandled in the first hours can never afterwards be recovered. Everything that Wensley had been unable to do at Hitchin, he had been unable to do because the thing had already been done wrongly before he came. The first reading of the scene as an accident, the clearing and the disturbance that followed from that reading, the days lost before the case was treated as a crime. These had removed the ground from beneath any investigation that came after. No skill applied late could replace the securing of the scene that had not been done early. It is in that lesson that the case found its lasting significance. The failure at Hitchin, the death that was first called a fall, and then could not be fastened upon any hand, is credited among the cases that helped to drive the reforms by which the investigation of murder in Britain was professionalised in the decades that followed. The securing of the scene, the preservation of evidence in its first condition, the prompt taking of statements while memory was fresh, the summoning of skilled investigators at once rather than after a provincial force had exhausted its own reading, these were the practices whose absence the Ridgely case made visible. The case that defeated even the detective from Whitechapel became, in the professional memory, an argument for doing at the outset what had not been done for Elizabeth Ridgely, and for never again leaving the first hours of a killing to be spent upon the theory that there had been no killing at all. The records of the case survive in the file held at the National Archives, which preserves the documentation of the murder and of the committal of John Healey for trial, and in the assize record of the trial itself. Much of the scene evidence, of course, was lost at the time, and could never be entered into any record, for the very failure that defines the case is the failure to have preserved it. What remains is the paper of the investigation and the court, the statements taken, the reconstruction assembled, the proceedings of the trial and its verdict. From these the case can be followed, but the one thing they cannot supply is the thing the first hours destroyed, the certain knowledge of who came to the shop on Nightingale Road upon that bitter evening and struck down the woman and her dog and emptied the till. The town of Hitchin kept its own memory of the case, as small towns keep the memory of the grave events that happen among them, and it has continued to be recalled in the local history of the place. The corner shop on Nightingale Road, the widow who kept it, the dog killed beside her, the 2 days of a shut and silent premises under snow, these entered the store of things the town remembered of itself. Beyond the town, the case has been carried in the wider history of British detective policing, where it holds a settled place as a demonstration of the first hour's failure that no later skill can mend. It has been the subject of a modern study by the historian Paul Stickler, whose examination of the case, published in 2018, is the fullest reconstruction of the matter that has been made, and it has been noticed in the retrospectives of the regional press and in the features of those who write upon the history of policing. It has passed into no film and no ballad. Its life in memory is the life of a policing case, a matter studied by those who study how crimes are investigated and how the investigation of them came to be reformed. The social setting in which the death occurred is inseparable from the shape the case took, and it bears a final setting out. The winter of the year 1919 was a winter of a country not yet settled after its war. The men were coming home in their numbers to towns that could not at once absorb them, and there was want among them, and there were among them men without work and without fixed place, drifting through the lodging houses of the market towns. The habit of a working shopkeeper of keeping her takings by her rather than in a bank belonged to an age in which the banking of small sums was not yet the universal practice of the working trades, and it left such a shopkeeper exposed to any who knew or supposed that money lay within her walls. The prejudice against the Irish that ran through English towns of the period was a real thing, and it was made, whether justly or not, the centre of a man's defence for his life. These were the conditions of the year, and it was within them, and not within any other, that Elizabeth Ridgely kept her shop and met her death, and the case must be understood as a case of the winter of 1919 and of no other time. The permanence of the question is the thing the record leaves standing above all else, and it is worth dwelling upon what precisely was and was not settled by the passage of the case through the courts. The acquittal of John Healey settled that the Crown had not proved him to be the killer. It did not settle that another had done it, nor that he had not, nor that anyone in particular ever would be found. The verdict answered the narrow question. The law asks whether this man, upon this evidence, could be found guilty beyond doubt, and it answered it in the negative. It left wholly open the wider question that the law was never framed to answer, which is what in fact had happened in the shop on Nightingale Road, and by whose hand. That wider question, the compromise beginning had already placed beyond reach before ever the trial was reached, and it has remained beyond reach since. Consider the shape of the thing that was never recovered. Upon a single winter evening, within the space of perhaps a few minutes, a woman of 54 years and the dog that shared her premises were both struck down. A quantity of money was taken from a till, and a person passed back out into a snowbound street and was gone. The whole of it turned upon the recovery of the traces of those few minutes, and those traces had a short life. They lived while the room stood as it was left. They began to die from the moment the room was entered and read as the scene of an accident, and they were dead, most of them, long before any hand that knew how to read them was brought to the place. What might have been learned from the undisturbed position of the weight, from the marks upon the floor and the counter, from the exact state of the door and its fastening, from the till and what lay about it, was learnable only once in the first hours, and the first hours were spent otherwise. The habit that had exposed Elizabeth Ridgely to her death is worth the setting out, for it belonged wholly to her class and her period, and it bears directly upon the motive the reconstruction supposed. A shopkeeper of her kind handled coin all the day long. The trade of a general shop was a trade of small sums, of pennies and halfpennies, and the occasional silver, taken across the counter for the small goods a neighbourhood bought from hour to hour. At the day's end, there was a till of such coin, and across a week the takings mounted to a sum worth the keeping. To bank that sum required a habit and an errand, and a trust in the bank that the working shopkeeper of that time had not always formed. Many kept the money by them, in the rooms above the shop, upon their persons, in the places about a dwelling where money is kept, and the keeping of it there was known, or could be supposed, by any who took the trouble to consider where a widow's week of takings might lie. It was a small independence that carried within it a small exposure, and in the winter of 1919, with want abroad and men on the roads, the exposure was not a slight one. The street itself, in the days after the discovery, must have worn the ordinary aspect of a street that has had a grave thing happen in it, and does not know what to do with the knowledge. The shop stood shut still, but shut now by the hand of the law rather than by the drawn blind of a living keeper. The neighbours who had murmured over the closed door had their unease answered in the worst manner, and the answer settled over the street. The snow that had lain through the days of the silence went on lying, and thawed at last as the winter turned, and the ordinary traffic of the road resumed about a premises that had become, in the small compass of the town, a marked place. Country towns absorb such marks slowly. A shop where a death of that kind has happened does not readily find another keeper, and the memory attaches to the brick and the window, and outlasts the particular grief. The assize system through which the case was tried belonged to an order of things that had stood for centuries, and would stand for some decades yet. Twice or more in the year the judges of the King's courts went out upon their circuits, coming to the county town to try the prisoners who had been committed to await them, and the graver charges, the charges that touched life, waited for those sittings. A man committed in the early spring for a killing might lie held until the summer assize, as Healy lay from the winter of the death to the June of the trial, and the county gathered to the assize town for the business of it. The trial of a murder was a public occasion of the county's life, attended and reported, and the verdict when it came was a public act. That the public act in this instance was an acquittal returned in 11 minutes made it no less public and no less final. The law had spoken the only word it had to speak, and having spoken it, it had no further word, and the case fell silent. There is a particular character to a case that ends not in the establishing of a truth, but in the failure to establish one, and the Ridgely case has that character wholly. It is not the case of a killer found and punished, nor the case of an innocent wrongly condemned and afterward cleared. It is the case of a killing that the machinery of justice took up, carried a certain distance, and set down again without conclusion, because the materials of a conclusion had been lost before the machinery properly engaged. The file that survives is the record of that carrying and that setting down. It holds the fact of the death, the fact of the botched beginning, the fact of the reconstruction, the fact of the trial, and the fact of the acquittal, and it holds, at its centre, the space where the answer would have been, had the answer been recoverable. That space is the thing the case is finally about, in the professional memory that has kept it. Every principle that the reformers afterward pressed, the securing of the scene, the preservation of the first condition of things, the early summoning of skill, the prompt taking of statement, was a principle framed against exactly that space, against the possibility that a killing might go forever unanswered, not because it was cleverly done, but because it was clumsily investigated. The killing on Nightingale Road may have been the work of a man who knew where the money lay and caught up the first heavy thing to hand, a matter of a few minutes and no great cunning. What defeated the law was not the cunning of the crime, but the mishandling of the aftermath. And it is that, the plain and remediable failure of the first hours, that made the case a lesson, rather than merely a sorrow. The woman herself remains, in the record, largely as her neighbours knew her, and scarcely otherwise. The fuller life, the parentage and the birthplace, the marriage that had made her a widow, and the years before she came to keep the shop are not preserved in the accessible account, and the honest record leaves them blank rather than filling them. What is preserved is the shopkeeper of Nightingale Road, the careful and somewhat nervous widow who kept her money by her and her dog about the premises, and served her neighbours through the short winter days, and who was found, after 2 days of a shut and silent shop, dead within the room where she had lived and traded. It is a narrow portrait, but it is the portrait the record supports, and the discipline of the record forbids the adding of anything to it that the record does not hold. The dog belongs to that portrait and cannot be set aside from it, for the dog is not merely a detail of pathos, but a fact of evidence, and it was as a fact of evidence that it broke the first false reading of the case. An animal killed by the same blows in the same room upon the same evening is a thing that no theory of accident can carry, and it was the terrier, as much as anything, that would not let the death be called a fall. That the animal died with its mistress is stated here once and plainly as the care of the record requires, and it is stated as the fact it was, a fact that pointed more surely than any sighting or any stain to the truth that a person had come into that shop and dealt out death to whatever lived within it. The case of Elizabeth Ridgely was the last of these 3 cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these 3 accounts, older than the others by 2 full generations, and set not in a quiet suburb or a snowbound market town, but in the crowded heart of the capital itself. It is a case that turned upon the same question that defeated the others, though it reached that question by a stranger road. For here the difficulty was not only who had died or how, but whether anyone would ever have known that a death had occurred at all. The case of Matilda Hacker, living under the name Miss Uish, begins in London in the autumn of 1877. London in that year was the largest city in the world, a metropolis of some 3.5 million people, its streets lit by gas, its air heavy with coal smoke, its river crossed by the great bridges and lined with wharves that received the trade of an empire. The district of Euston Square lay in the parish of St Pancras, a little to the north of the city's centre, within sight of the 2 great railway termini at Euston and King's Cross, from which the trains ran north to the manufacturing towns and to Scotland. It was a neighbourhood of tall terraced houses, built in the earlier part of the century for prosperous families, and now, by the 1870s, given over in large part to lodgings. These were respectable streets in appearance, faced in stucco and brick, 4 and 5 stories high, with railings before them and steps leading up to painted doors. Behind those doors the arrangement was often the same. A family held the lease of the whole house and lived in a portion of it, letting the remaining rooms to lodgers who came and went, paying weekly for a bedroom and the use of a sitting room, taking their meals sometimes with the household and sometimes alone. A single servant or 2 did the work of the house. Coal was delivered through a plate in the pavement and stored in a cellar below the level of the street, from which it was carried up in scuttles to feed the fires in every room. It was an ordinary way of living for tens of thousands of Londoners, and it depended entirely upon a degree of trust between people who were, in truth, strangers to one another. The house at the centre of this account was number 4 Euston Square. It was held on lease by a Luxembourg-born cabinet maker named Saverin Bastendorf, a maker of bamboo furniture, who lived there with his wife and their children, and who let the upper rooms to lodgers in the usual way. The servant of the house at the relevant time was a young woman named Hannah Dobbs. Into this house, in the earlier part of 1877, there came an elderly lady who gave her name as Miss Uish, and who took the second-floor rooms. She was, in reality, Matilda Hacker of Canterbury, though no one in the house knew that name, and the concealment of it was the deliberate work of many years. To understand how a woman of property came to be living under a false name in a London lodging house, it is necessary to go back to Canterbury, in the county of Kent, where Matilda Hacker had been born early in the century. The year is given variously, but she was born in the 1810s, which made her, by the autumn of 1877, a woman in her 60s. Her father was a man of some means who owned property in the city, and upon his death that property, and the rents it produced, passed to his daughters. Matilda had a sister named Amelia, and the two women lived together for many years, unmarried, in comfortable circumstances, supported by the income from the houses their father had left them. The sisters were well known in Canterbury, and known for a particular reason. They dressed alike, and they dressed elaborately, in a style that had been fashionable in their youth, and which they did not abandon as they aged. They wore ringlets and bright sashes and gowns of a kind that drew notice in the streets of a cathedral city, and they were spoken of, half in affection and half in mockery, as the Canterbury Belles. They kept to their own ways, consulted a book of dreams for guidance in their affairs, and grew, as the years passed, increasingly eccentric in their habits and increasingly solitary in their manner of living. Amelia died in the 1870s, and after her death Matilda was left alone with the family's property and its rents. She was by then an elderly woman of settled and peculiar habits, with money coming to her from the Canterbury houses, and no one dependent upon her, and no household of her own, to keep. It was in these years that her defining behaviour took its final and fatal shape. Matilda Hacker conceived a deep and abiding objection to paying the rates, the local taxes levied upon property, and she determined to avoid the collectors of those rates by any means available to her. The method she chose was concealment of herself. Rather than live openly in a house of her own, where the rate collector would know where to find her, she took to lodging in furnished rooms in London and elsewhere, under names that were not her own, moving from one lodging to another whenever she judged it prudent, and never remaining long enough or openly enough in any one place to be traced. She collected her rents through intermediaries and correspondence, and she guarded the secret of her whereabouts with great care. It was a way of arranging her affairs that suited her temperament, secretive and independent, but it carried within it a consequence she cannot have foreseen. The consequence was this: a woman who lives under false names, who tells no one where she is, who moves without notice, and receives no visitors who know her true identity, has made herself, in the most literal sense, impossible to miss. Her own relatives did not know what name she was using or in what house she was lodging. Should she disappear, there would be no one to remark upon her absence, no one to inquire after her, no one to report her missing, because no one would know that she was gone, or from where. The very care she had taken to hide from the rate collector had hidden her from everyone else as well. By the autumn of 1877, this concealment had brought Matilda Hacker to the second floor of 4 Euston Square, where she lived quietly as Miss Wish, an elderly, single lady of comfortable means, keeping her rooms, consulting her dream book, and paying her rent. She had brought with her the small possessions of such a woman: a watch, items of jewellery, articles of clothing of the elaborate old-fashioned kind she had always favoured. To the household she was simply the lodger on the second floor, one of the transient figures such houses were built to accommodate, and there is no indication that anyone thought her remarkable beyond her age and her dress. Then, in October of that year, she was seen no more. There was no announcement of her going and no disturbance that anyone afterward could clearly recall. The rooms she had occupied were, in time, let to others. When any inquiry was made concerning the elderly lady who had lodged there, the answer given by the household was that she had gone away, which was the ordinary fate of lodgers, and excited no suspicion whatever. No missing person report was made. No relative came to ask after her. The rate collectors she had spent her later years evading did not know where to look for her, and would not have looked in a coal cellar in St Pancras. For the space of some 18 months, the disappearance of Matilda Hacker was not a mystery, because it was not known to have happened. During those 18 months, life at 4 Euston Square continued as before. The Bastendorf family lived in the house, took their meals, conducted the business of the furniture trade, and let the rooms above. Lodgers came and went. Coal was delivered through the pavement plate and stored below, and carried up to the fires. The household passed its days in the ordinary way of a London lodging house, and there was nothing in its outward life to suggest that anything was wrong, or that the question of what had become of the old lady in the second-floor rooms was a question that anyone needed to ask. It was in May of 1879, a year and a half after Matilda Hacker had last been seen, that the ordinary life of the house was interrupted. A workman was engaged in clearing out the coal cellar, the low space beneath the level of the street where the fuel for the house was stored. In the course of that work, beneath the coal and the coal dust that had accumulated there, he came upon human remains. About the neck there was a cord. The body had lain there, concealed, for the whole of the intervening period, while the household lived and ate, and let its rooms in the stories above. The Metropolitan Police were called to the house, and the investigation into the death was formally opened. The first and most pressing task was identification, and here the very anonymity that had marked the dead woman's life presented itself again. The remains could not be identified by name in any simple way, for the household knew the lodger only as Miss Wish, and Miss Wish was a name that led nowhere. What survived and what proved decisive was clothing. The garments found with the remains were of a distinctive and old-fashioned character, elaborate in the manner that Matilda Hacker had worn all her life, and it was through these and through the patient tracing of her possessions that the dead woman was at last given her true name. The tracing of the dead woman's possessions became, from that point, the central labour of the investigation. Officers were dispatched to make inquiries at the pawnbrokers of the district and beyond, for it was known that articles of value belonging to the missing lodger, a watch and items of jewellery among them, were no longer in the house, and had not been found with the remains. A watch in particular could be followed, for pawnbrokers kept records of the articles pledged with them and of the persons who pledged them, and it was through such records that the property of Matilda Hacker was gradually recovered, and its passage from hand to hand established. The inquiries led the police to the former servant of the house, Hannah Dobbs, who had been in service at 4 Euston Square during the period in which the lodger had disappeared, and who had since left that employment. It was established that articles which had belonged to the dead woman had been pawned, and that Hannah Dobbs had been the person who pledged them. She was found to have been in possession of the watch and of other property belonging to Matilda Hacker, and to have turned that property into money at the pawnshops. Upon this evidence, she was arrested and charged with the murder. The difficulty that lay at the heart of the case declared itself as soon as the charge was laid. 18 months had passed between the disappearance and the discovery. In that time, the trail had grown cold in every particular that mattered to a prosecution. The victim had lived under a false name, so that the very fact of her death had gone unrecorded and uninvestigated for the whole of that interval. There was no witness who could say when she had died, or where in the house, or by whose hand. There was the body and the cord about the neck, and the possessions that had been carried away and pawned, and beyond these the record was silence. A post-mortem examination of the remains was conducted by a medical man, so far as the condition of the remains, after so long an interval, would permit. The examination established that the cause of death was strangulation, a ligature having been drawn about the neck, and the cord found with the body was consistent with that finding, That much could be determined. What could not be determined, and what the passage of 18 months had placed forever beyond reach, was the time of death, with any precision. The medical evidence could speak to how Matilda Hacker had died. It could not fix the day, or the week, or with confidence even the month, and this uncertainty would prove fatal to the case the Crown wished to bring. The medical findings were placed before a coroner's inquest. The public hearing convened to inquire into a death of a suspicious kind, which may determine how a person came by their death, and may name a person as responsible, though it does not itself convict. The inquest sat upon the remains found in the cellar and heard the evidence of their discovery, of their identification through the distinctive clothing, and of the medical examination that had established strangulation as the cause of death. The proceedings following the evidence resulted in Hannah Dobbs being committed for trial, sent forward to answer the charge of murder before the higher criminal court of the capital. That court was the central criminal court, known throughout the country as the Old Bailey, where the most serious offences committed in London were tried. The case had by now become a public sensation. The newspapers had seized upon it under the name by which it would be remembered, the Euston Square Mystery, and the details of it, a body hidden beneath the coal for a year and a half in an ordinary lodging house, while the family lived above, were of a kind to command the widest attention. The penny press of the day, cheap and abundant, and read by hundreds of thousands, carried the discovery and the arrest and the approach of the trial to every quarter of the city and far beyond it. The trial of Hannah Dobbs for the murder of Matilda Hacker commenced at the Old Bailey in July of 1879. The prisoner pleaded not guilty. The case for the Crown was, of necessity, a circumstantial one, for there was no direct evidence of the killing, no witness to it, and no confession. The prosecution rested upon the association of the accused with the house and with the dead woman, upon her presence there during the period of the disappearance, and above all, upon her possession of the property of the murdered woman and her disposal of that property at the pawnbroker's. It was argued that the person who had taken and pawned the possessions of Matilda Hacker was the person who had killed her and concealed her body beneath the coal. The defence met this argument at its weakest points, and there were several. The Crown could not prove when Matilda Hacker had died, and a case that cannot fix the time of a death labours under a great disadvantage in fixing responsibility for it. The Crown could not prove where in the house the killing had taken place, nor produce any witness who had seen or heard anything of it, though the house had been full of people. And the defence pressed the physical improbability of the thing charged, that a single young woman could alone have overpowered and strangled a grown woman, carried or dragged the body to the cellar, concealed it beneath the coal, and cleaned away every trace of the deed so completely that no member of the household had remarked upon anything amiss for 18 months. Possession of the dead woman's goods, the defence maintained, was not the same thing as guilt of her murder. Property might be taken by one who had not killed. The pawning of a watch proved theft, or the handling of stolen goods, but it did not of itself prove that the hand which pawned the watch had drawn the cord about the neck of its owner. Between the certain fact that Hannah Dobbs had possessed and pledged the property of Matilda Hacker, and the fact the Crown sought to establish, that Hannah Dobbs had murdered her, there lay a gap that the circumstantial evidence, however suggestive, did not close. The jury, having heard the evidence and the arguments of counsel and the direction of the court, retired to consider its verdict. It returned a verdict of not guilty. Hannah Dobbs was acquitted of the murder of Matilda Hacker and discharged. No one else was ever charged with the killing. The question of who had strangled the elderly lodger and hidden her beneath the coal, having failed of an answer in the one trial the case ever produced, was never afterward resolved by any court. The acquittal did not end the public life of the case. It began instead its second and stranger chapter, which was fought not in a courtroom, but in the pages of cheap pamphlets sold in the streets. Hannah Dobbs, freed and beyond the reach of any further charge for the murder, put her name to a printed statement, sold to a public eager to read it, in which she gave her own account of the household at 4 Euston Square and of what she claimed to have known of its affairs. The statement did not confess, it accused. In it she turned upon her former employer, Severin Bastendorf, and laid at his door a knowledge of, and a hand in, the deaths that had occurred beneath his roof. The allegations contained in that pamphlet were grave, and they must be understood for what they were. They were the assertions of an acquitted woman who had every interest in directing suspicion away from herself, published for profit and untested by any court. Severin Bastendorf had not been charged with the murder of Matilda Hacker. He was never charged with it. The accusations against him rest upon the word of a party who is neither disinterested nor sworn, and they cannot be treated as established fact. They belong to the record of the scandal that followed the trial, not to the record of what was proved concerning the death. Severin Bastendorf did not suffer the accusations in silence. He answered them as the quarrel was conducted in print, and he took the matter to law, suing over the statements published against him. What followed was a public contest of duelling pamphlets, the servant's account and the master's rebuttal set against one another, and sold to a readership that had followed the mystery from the first discovery in the cellar. The affair was fought out before the whole reading public of London, and it made of the 2 principal figures in the household objects of a lasting and destructive notoriety. Whatever the truth of the deaths at Euston Square, the scandal itself was ruin to the man at the centre of it. Severin Bastendorf, tradesman and leaseholder, saw his business, his standing, and his household broken by the affair. His decline was steep, and it was final. He was confined for a time in an asylum, and died at the last of heart disease, his life closing in illness after the destruction of everything he had built. That is the one downstream fact of the aftermath that the record establishes plainly, and it is set down here without embellishment. The later course of Hannah Dobbs's life, by contrast, is poorly documented, and where the record falls silent, it is left silent. What became of her after the pamphlet had sold its copies and the sensation had cooled is not established with any certainty, and the accounts that survive do not agree. It would be an error to invent a fate for her, or to convert rumour into narrative. The one certain fact of her legal history is the verdict of July 1879, the acquittal, and beyond that the case does not permit a confident account of her. The mystery entered the culture of its day with great force, and has kept a place in the literature of Victorian London crime ever since. In its own time, it was one of the most widely reported cases of the decade, carried by the daily and weekly papers under the name of the Euston Square Mystery, and the pamphlets to which it gave rise, the statement of Hannah Dobbs, and the reply it provoked, are themselves among the documents of the affair, artefacts of a moment when a criminal sensation could be sold in the streets in the form of a printed booklet. The trial record survives in the archive of the Central Criminal Court, a primary source that fixes the charge, the evidence, and the verdict beyond dispute. In the years since, the case has continued to draw the attention of those who study the unsolved crimes of the period. Modern reconstructions have examined the evidence anew, weighing the circumstantial case against Hannah Dobbs and finding it, as the jury found it, suggestive but unproven. These accounts treat the death of Matilda Hacker as a genuine mystery, a crime whose author was never established, rather than as a case solved in substance and lost only on a technicality. The evidence points in a direction. It does not arrive at a conclusion. An honest treatment of the case has respected that distinction. The historical interest of the case lies less in its legal outcome, which was an acquittal and no more, than in the circumstances that made it possible. It is remembered as the classic instance of the body concealed in the ordinary house, hidden for 18 months beneath the coal of a lodging in a respectable London square, while the life of the household went on above it undisturbed. It is remembered too for the peculiar condition of the victim, a woman of property who had made herself a stranger to everyone, whose death went unremarked because her life had been arranged, with great care and over many years, so that no one would know where she was. That arrangement is the social heart of the case, and it belongs to the particular world of Victorian London that produced it. The great city drew into itself a vast transient population, people who lived in furnished rooms, under names that the landlord took on trust, who moved from lodging to lodging without record, who might be known to a household for months and remain, in every important sense, unknown. A person could live in such a city, among millions, and be accounted for by no one. The system of lodgings that housed Matilda Hacker also concealed her, and the anonymity that a great city confers, which she had sought out and cultivated for her own purposes, became the condition of her disappearance and the shield of whoever killed her. She had feared the rate collector and had spent her later years evading him, moving under false names to keep her Canterbury rents beyond the reach of the tax upon her property. The evasion succeeded in its narrow object, and it succeeded far beyond it. The collectors never found her, neither did anyone else. When she vanished from the second-floor rooms in the autumn of 1877, there was no one who knew her by her right name in that house, no relative who could say where she had gone, no authority that had a record of Miss Wish, and so there was no inquiry, because there was no one to make one, and nothing that anyone knew to be missing. The rates she had guarded so jealously were, in the end, a small sum set against the property and the income she possessed, and the elaborate concealment she built to protect them cost her, at the last, the ordinary safeguard that a known name and a fixed place among people affords. Her identity, when it was needed, had to be reconstructed from the clothes she had died in, and the watch that had been carried from her body to a pawn shop. The name Matilda Hacker was restored to the remains in the cellar only by the patient work of officers tracing a trail of pledged possessions backward to a woman who, in life, had taken every care that no such trail should ever lead to her. The trail of those possessions was, in the reconstruction of the case, the one continuous thread that ran from the cellar back into the life that had ended there. A watch of value, a ring, articles of personal jewellery, the small portable wealth that an elderly woman of means carried upon her person and kept about her rooms, these were the objects that had outlived their owner and had gone on moving through the city after she had ceased to move at all. Each pledge at a pawnbroker left its trace, a ticket, an entry in a ledger, a sum advanced against the article, and a name, true or false, given by the person who advanced it. And it was upon these commercial records, kept for the ordinary purposes of trade, that the identification of the dead woman finally turned. The pawnbroking trade of Victorian London was vast, respectable in its way, and closely woven into the daily economy of the poorer and the middling sort, who pledged and redeemed their goods in a constant weekly cycle as money came in and ran out. The 3 brass balls hung above shop fronts in every district, and behind the counter the broker recorded what was brought to him. A watch was among the most traceable of articles, for it might carry a maker's name and a number, and its passage could be followed where a coin or a length of cloth could not. That a watch belonging to Matilda Hacker had been pledged, and by whom, was therefore a fact that the investigation could establish with a precision that almost nothing else about the case allowed. The property that had been carried from her body spoke in this way more clearly than any witness. The house had yielded no account of when she died. The medical examination could not fix the day, but the pawnshop ledgers fixed dates upon which her possessions had been turned into money, and those dates, set against the last time she had been seen alive in the autumn of 1877, framed the interval within which she must have died. The objects testified to their own removal from her keeping, and in doing so they testified, however imperfectly, to the removal of their owner from the world. The world those objects had belonged to was the world of a particular kind of Victorian woman, unmarried, propertied, and answerable to no one. Matilda Hacker had passed from the comfortable eccentricity of the Canterbury years into a solitary and secretive old age, and the possessions found upon her and traced from her were the residue of that earlier life. The watch and the jewellery of a lady who had once walked the streets of a cathedral city in ringlets and bright sashes and been pointed out to strangers. She had carried the habits and the ornaments of that life into her London lodgings, into the room she took under a borrowed name, and they had remained with her to the end, the last visible tokens of who she had been. Her days in those second-floor rooms had been ordered by the small private rituals of a woman living alone. She consulted her dream book, the volume that professed to interpret the meaning of dreams and to draw from them guidance for the conduct of affairs and even the choice of numbers, and she consulted it daily, a habit of long standing that had followed her from Canterbury to Euston Square. It was the practice of a superstitious and solitary temperament, and it belonged to the same cast of mind that had built the elaborate machinery of her concealment. A woman who trusted to private systems and hidden knowledge and kept her own counsel in all things. The rooms themselves were the ordinary furnished lodgings of the period, a bedroom and the use of a sitting room on the second floor of a tall terraced house, heated by a coal fire that the servant laid and lit in the evenings, by gas or by candle, and reached by the common staircase that the whole household used. Below, at the foot of the house, lay the kitchen and the offices and the cellar, and above, on the upper floors, the other let rooms. It was a house of many separate lives lived close together and yet apart, each lodger keeping to their own rooms, meeting the others upon the stairs, knowing them by sight and by the name they gave, and no further than that. Into such a house a stranger might come and a stranger go, and the coming and the going leave scarcely a mark. The whole arrangement of the London lodging depended upon a discretion that shaded easily into indifference. A lodger who paid was a lodger welcome. A lodger who left was a lodger replaced. The question of where a departed lodger had gone was not, in the ordinary run of things, a question that the household felt any need to press. And when it was said of Miss Wish that she'd gone away, the saying of it closed the matter as completely as if it had been true. The coal cellar in which she was found was the most ordinary feature of such a house, and it is worth setting plainly what it was, for it is the place upon which the whole case rests. Beneath the pavement of the London terrace ran a vault, entered by a plate of iron, let into the flagstones above, through which the coalman tipped his sack so that the fuel fell into the cellar without being carried through the house. From that store the coal was drawn as it was wanted, scuttle by scuttle, and carried up to the grates in every occupied room. It was a place visited daily for the drawing of fuel, and yet a place where coal lay heaped and shifting, where dust gathered thick and black, and where a thing laid low and covered over might not be come upon in the ordinary drawing of a day's supply. For 18 months, the daily drawing of coal from that cellar had gone on above and around the concealed remains without disturbing them, until the deeper labour of clearing the cellar out brought the workmen down to what lay beneath. The interval is the measure of the concealment. It was not that the cellar was never entered, it was entered constantly. It was that what had been hidden there was hidden well enough and low enough beneath the coal to survive the constant ordinary use of the place for a year and a half, and to be found only when the store was emptied to its floor. That so long a period could pass is explained, in the end, less by the cleverness of any concealment than by the completeness of the victim's own disappearance from the knowledge of others. A body may be well hidden and still be sought if its owner is missed, and inquiry set on foot. Here there was no seeking, because there was no missing. The concealment in the cellar was matched by a concealment in life so thorough that the two together produced the 18 months of silence. The hidden remains beneath, and above them a world in which no single person knew that anyone was gone. The property from which her income came lay in Canterbury, in the county of Kent, some 60 miles to the southeast of the capital, a cathedral city of ancient standing and modest size, its life ordered around the great church and the trade of the surrounding farmland. It was there that her father had held houses and drawn rents from them, and there that the two sisters had lived their conspicuous and comfortable lives, and there that the property had descended to Matilda upon the deaths that left her the last of the family. The rents of those houses were the foundation of everything that followed, for they gave her means without tying her to any single place, an income that could be collected at a distance and carried wherever she chose to go. Upon property of that kind fell the rates, the local taxes levied for the upkeep of the parish and its services, assessed upon houses and payable by those who held them. To the owner of rented houses the rates were a recurring charge, demanded by the collectors who went their rounds, with their books and their receipts, and it was this charge and the men who came to levy it that Matilda Hacker had set herself so determinedly to evade. The sums at stake were not, by the measure of her income, large. The evasion of them, however, had become with her a fixed purpose, pursued with an ingenuity and a persistence out of all proportion to the money saved, until it governed the whole manner of her life. To avoid the collector, she had made herself untraceable, and untraceability in the London of the 1870s was a thing that could be had by anyone willing to live under an assumed name and to keep moving. The city offered no register that could pin a private lodger to a place. There was no requirement that a person give their true name to take furnished rooms, no central record of who lodged where, no means by which a collector of rates in Canterbury could discover that the woman he sought was living under another name on the second floor of a house near Euston Square. She had simply to change her name and her address often enough, and to tell no one who could betray her, and the pursuit was defeated. The district she had come to was among the busiest in London, dominated by the two great railway stations that stood close together on the Euston Road. Euston, the older of them, was the London terminus of the line to the northwest and to Scotland, its entrance marked by a vast stone arch that had stood since before the middle of the century. Beside it, a little to the east, stood King's Cross, terminus of the line to the northeast, and near that the newer station of St Pancras was rising or newly risen, with its great hotel. About these termini gathered all the traffic and trade that great stations draw, the cabs and the porters, the hotels and the eating houses, and the endless stream of travellers arriving in the capital and departing from it. The presence of the stations shaped the character of the surrounding streets. The tall terraced houses that had been built for single families now served, many of them, as lodgings and boarding houses catering to the transient population that the railways brought and carried away, and to the clerks and tradespeople and single persons of small means who needed rooms near the centre of the city. It was a district of arrivals and departures, of people passing through, of households that made their living by letting rooms to strangers, and it was exactly the kind of place in which a person who wished to be no one in particular could most easily succeed in being so. The house at 4 Euston Square stood among such houses, and the trade carried on within it, the letting of rooms and the making of bamboo furniture, was of a piece with the mixed commercial and domestic life of the neighbourhood. Severin Bastendorf was one of the many foreign-born craftsmen and tradesmen who had settled in London and made their livelihood in it, a cabinet maker working in the light and fashionable bamboo ware that the period admired, and the house was at once his home, his lodging-house, and the seat of his trade. It was an unremarkable establishment in an unremarkable street, and the ordinariness of it is precisely what made the concealment within it so complete, and, when it was uncovered, so shocking to the public that read of it. For the public did read of it in enormous numbers when the discovery in the cellar became known and the trial approached. The cheap press of the 1870s had grown into a great industry, its penny and halfpenny papers printed in editions of hundreds of thousands and sold on every street. And a case of this kind, the hidden body, the long concealment, the ordinary house, the servant charged, was precisely the matter upon which that press thrived. The Euston Square mystery, as the papers named it, was followed from the first reports of the discovery through the arrest and the committal to the opening of the trial. Each stage set out at length for a readership that could not have enough of it. The reporting brought the machinery of the law before that readership in full detail. The proceedings at the police court, the evidence of the pawnbrokers and the officers, the identification through the clothing, the medical testimony as to the cause of death, all of it was carried in the papers and read and discussed across the city and the country. By the time the case came on at the Old Bailey, it was among the best-known criminal matters in England, and the acquittal, when it came, was carried as widely as everything that had gone before, so that the failure of the prosecution to establish who had killed Matilda Hacker was itself a public event, reported and argued over in the same columns that had followed the case from its beginning. The task that had faced the officers charged with the investigation is worth measuring against the ordinary run of such work, for it was a task made almost impossible by delay. In the usual case of a violent death, the investigation begins while the trail is fresh, when witnesses remember, when the scene is undisturbed, when the time of death can be fixed within narrow limits, and the movements of those concerned reconstructed hour by hour. Here the investigation began 18 months after the death, with a scene long since given over to ordinary use, with witnesses whose memories of a particular departed lodger had grown dim among the many lodgers who had come and gone, and with a body from which the passage of so long an interval had stripped away the evidence of time. Every advantage that early inquiry gives to the pursuit of a killer had been lost before the pursuit could begin. The officers came to the case not as investigators of a fresh crime, but as reconstructors of an old one, working backward from a body and a cord, and a scatter of pawned possessions, toward a death that no one had witnessed, and no one had reported, and no one could date. That they established the identity of the victim at all, from her clothing and her watch, was itself a considerable feat of patient inquiry. That they could not in the end establish who had killed her, and that the one trial the case produced ended in an acquittal, was less a failure of the officers than a consequence of the 18 months that had passed before anyone knew there was a crime to investigate. The principle upon which the acquittal rested was one long settled in English criminal law, and the case illustrates it as clearly as any. A conviction for murder required proof beyond reasonable doubt, proof that satisfied the jury not merely that the accused might have done the deed, or was the likeliest of those who might, but that no reasonable explanation of the evidence remained consistent with innocence. Circumstantial evidence could meet that standard, and often did, where the circumstances formed a chain complete enough to admit no other conclusion. But where a link was missing, where the chain suggested guilt without compelling it, the law required that the doubt be resolved in favour of the prisoner. In the case of Matilda Hacker, the chain was broken at more than one point. The possession of the dead woman's goods was consistent with murder, but it was consistent also with theft alone, with the taking of property from a woman already dead by another hand, or with the handling of goods that had passed through more hands than one. The absence of any fixed time of death meant that the accused could not be placed at the scene at the moment of the killing, for the moment of the killing could not itself be placed. And the sheer physical difficulty of the crime, one woman charged with overpowering, strangling, moving and concealing another, and then maintaining that concealment undetected for a year and a half in an occupied house, was a difficulty the prosecution could assert its way around, but could not dispose of by evidence. Faced with such gaps, the jury did what the law directed it to do. It did not pronounce upon whether Hannah Dobbs was innocent, in fact, for that was not the question before it. It pronounced upon whether the Crown had proved her guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and it found that the Crown had not. The verdict of not guilty was in its strict meaning a finding that the case had not been made, not a finding that no crime had been committed, nor that the accused had played no part in the events, at Euston Square. The distinction is a fine one, and it was lost upon much of the public, but it is the distinction upon which the whole outcome of the case depends, and it is the reason the murder stands, to this day, as unresolved rather than as answered and unpunished. The condition that made the crime possible, the anonymity of a great city's lodging life, was not peculiar to Matilda Hacker, though few carried it to the extreme that she did. London in the 1870s contained a floating population of a size that defies precise reckoning. Men and women who held no settled home, who moved from furnished room to furnished room as work or circumstance or inclination dictated, who were known to their landlords by a week's rent and a given name, and by nothing further. Among such a multitude, a person might live and die with scarcely a record made, and the machinery by which society kept account of its members, the parish, the census, the registrar, touched the settled and the propertied far more surely than it touched the transient. The census, taken every 10th year, caught a person only on the single night of its enumeration, and a lodger absent or misnamed on that night passed through its net unrecorded. The registration of deaths, established by law earlier in the century, depended upon a death being known and reported, and a death that no one knew of could not be registered. The apparatus of record, extensive as it had become, assumed that a person's absence would be noticed by someone with reason to notice it. A family, an employer, a neighbour, a landlord expecting rent. Where no such person existed, the apparatus had nothing to work upon, and a human being could slip out of the account of the living without a single official mark of their going. Matilda Hacker had made herself deliberately into such a person. She had severed the connections by which she might have been missed, not through misfortune or poverty, which severed them for many, but by design and in pursuit of a private economy. She had money, family, and property, every ordinary anchor by which a life is held in place and accounted for, and she had cut herself loose from all of them, rather than surrender a portion of her rents to the rate collector. The result was that a woman of independent means came to share the condition of the most rootless of the city's poor, the condition of being no one whose disappearance would be remarked, and it was in that condition that she died. The modern study of the case has fixed upon precisely this, that the crime was less an ordinary murder than a demonstration of how completely a person could vanish in Victorian London, and how little the machinery of law and record could do when confronted with a death it had never been told to look for. The evidence against the one person charged has been weighed and found, as the jury found it, suggestive and incomplete. The identity of the killer has not been established by any later inquiry, and the honest reconstructions of the case do not pretend otherwise. What they establish, and what the case chiefly teaches, is the vulnerability that attended a certain kind of life, the respectable woman living alone under a false name, beyond the knowledge of her kin, in a city large enough to swallow her. The name that was restored to her in death was the name she had spent her last years erasing. To the household she had been Miss Uish, and Miss Uish was a fiction, a name attached to no family, no property, no history, a name that led the inquiry nowhere when first it was pressed. Only through the clothing she had died in, the elaborate old-fashioned garments of the Canterbury belle grown old, and through the watch and jewellery traced backward from the pawn shops, was the fiction stripped away and the true woman recovered. Matilda Hacker of Canterbury, spinster of independent means, dead by strangulation in the autumn of 1877 and lost beneath the coal until the spring of 1879. The recovery of the name did not bring the recovery of an answer. It fixed who had died and roughly when, and by what means, and it fixed nothing more. The court that tried the single charge the case produced returned the accused to liberty, and no further charge was ever laid. The scandal that followed, fought out in pamphlets and in a suit at law, spread suspicion widely and settled it nowhere, and the man at the centre of that scandal went to his end in an asylum without ever having answered any charge over the death itself, for none was ever brought against him. Around the death of Matilda Hacker, there gathered accusation, notoriety, and a lasting public interest, and at the centre of all of it, there remained a space where the answer should have been, and was not. The case of Matilda Hacker was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete.